So here we have Maggie and Sarah, and Danny is going to introduce them.
That's true. Okay, great. Well, that was a really good, but I'll say something. We're delighted to welcome back Maggie Frye and Sara Lopus to Berkeley Demography. I'll introduce you each. Okay. So Maggie received her PhD from Berkeley in Sociology and Demography in 2013, completed a postdoc at Harvard, served as an assistant professor of sociology at Princeton, and is now assistant professor of sociology at Michigan. Her work is at the intersection of sociology of culture, population, gender, and inequality, and has appeared in our leading journals and been recognized for its excellence by no fewer than 6, probably more by now, ASA sections. Sara Lopus received her PhD in 2015 from Berkeley in demography and completed a postdoc at Princeton. Did you overlap?
Yep, yes, that's how we started.
Oh, well, but we take the credit here. Before beginning as assistant professor at Cal Poly, her work focuses on food security, education, and ecology. It's appeared in JMF, as well as in journals in geography and food systems. I'm introducing them together now, not just because they won the 2013 and 2015 Hamel dissertation prizes, although that's another nice coincidence, but because they've struck up an exciting partnership focused on marriage, education, and stratification. So,
great. Okay, we're so happy to be here and back in the seminar room. And just delighted to see so many faces that helped us get to where we are today. So thanks for welcoming us back to the department. Today we're going to share the results of a body of research that we're working on together that pertains to educational attainment in Africa and how it shapes subsequent life course events. And specifically, we've been asking questions about what it means for a woman to have a given level of educational attainment when she exists in a broader educational context. So to begin our talk today, we'll provide some background information about education across Africa, and we'll explain why Africa is a uniquely interesting and informative setting for asking and answering questions about educational context and how it shapes demographic behaviors. We'll introduce you to the DHS data that we use in our research, and that data spans 5 decades and 32 countries across Africa. Next, we'll describe our general methodological approach, including a quick presentation of the results of a paper that we published together in Demography last December. And then the bulk of our time today will be used to describe our current project in this area, in which we investigate educational assortative mating across Africa in order to understand how educational context shapes norms, status, and the strength of boundaries between social groups. Once we explain how assortative mating patterns are affected both by constraints in composition and by social conventions, we'll walk you through our methodological approach, our results, and our principal conclusions. This talk takes a little bit of an unorthodox approach in the order in which we present things. We don't put all of our methods up front, and so there is a chance that if you have a question about our methods, that answer is going to come a little bit later in a subsequent slide. Okay. So with this slide, we're giving you a glimpse of our data in order to provide you with some of the background information about recent changes in educational opportunities in Africa. And a little later, we'll talk more about the data that we use, but for now, you can know that we're using DHS data, and we're taking national birth cohorts as our unit of analysis. So to begin, let's explore the educational context across Africa in the past 60 or so years. And this figure shows for each of the countries that we study, the percent of a given cohort that attended any school at all. And on the x-axis, we show the median birth year for each country cohort. So since the 1950s, educational access has expanded in all sub-Saharan African countries, as evidenced by the upward sloping lines in the figure. But we also see this staggering heterogeneity in educational context. The data span almost the entire range of the y-axis, from country cohorts in which virtually no one attended any school at all, to country cohorts in which 95% of people have attended some school. We also see these stark geographic differences in the rate and the degree of educational expansion, with the lowest levels of expansion in West Africa and the highest levels in Central and Southern Africa. Okay, so as you saw in the previous slide, our chosen measure of educational context is the percent of individuals who have attended any school at all. There are various other measures of educational context that we could have used, but after thinking about this for a very long time, back in the summer of 2016 when we started working together on this project, we came to decide that in the African context, the percent ever educated has a few clear advantages. And so, first of all, given the preponderance of contexts in which it's a real rarity to have ever attended any school at all, our chosen measure allows us to observe educational expansion in its most basic form. And so other measures, like the percent who achieve some higher level of educational expansion, would miss, or educational attainment, would miss these very early stages of educational expansion. And then we find the percent who ever attended school to be preferable to mean years of education because it does a better job of expressing the educational access for the cohort as a whole, especially in contexts in which a minority of people attended school. And so a mean measure could be skewed by the very high educational attainment of an elite few, although you'll see that, the two measures are very highly correlated. Okay. So at the core of our methodological approach is our desire to investigate the interplay between individual level educational characteristics and broader social context within which individuals operate. And so because our intention is to position individuals within their broader social context, we take a cohort-based approach. And so this allows us to understand the context of individuals' childhoods when they were or were not attending school, and also as teens or young adults when they were getting married. In countries with very rapid increases in education, one woman may have come of age at a time when education was very scarce, and another woman born only a decade later may have had ready access to schooling during her childhood. And so a birth cohort-based approach allows us to place men and women within their specific positions along the country's educational expansion, and to differentiate between contrasting educational contexts that are often found within the same DHS survey. Okay. So we use DHS data from 32 African countries, reflecting a total sample size of over 700,000 women, over 600,000 couples, and from 267 country birth cohorts. This map shows the countries that are included in our analyses, and you can see that the shading represents the number of years that we observed a country, going from Angola, for which we have 26 birth years, because only one DHS survey was conducted in Angola, up to Tanzania, where we observe 50 birth years because of repeated DHS surveys, which were conducted over the course of many years. So, as I described a few minutes ago, our research is predicated on the idea that marital behaviors will be influenced both by individual level educational characteristics and also by the broader social context within which individuals operate. And so, of course, we expect to see strong links between individual level educational attainment and marital behaviors. Across Africa, women who progress further in school tend to adopt a different set of marital behaviors than their less educated peers. And so well-educated women tend to marry later, and they might also adopt distinct dating and matchmaking behaviors, moving from a familial choice paradigm to one of individual mate selection. So this woman on the left, who has little or no formal schooling, as evidenced by the silhouette of a schoolgirl, may adhere to a very different set of marital behaviors than this woman on the right, who has progressed quite far in school. But education is also an aggregate phenomenon in that the social meaning of a woman's educational attainment depends on the educational composition of her peer group. So imagine a country or a community or a cohort where most women are highly educated. What kind of marital behaviors do we expect a highly educated woman to exhibit in that context? And do we expect a less educated woman in that same country, in that same context, to exhibit particularly unique behaviors because she represents such a minority in this setting? Or do we expect her to replicate the marital behaviors of her highly educated age mates? And now imagine a country or a community or a cohort where most women have never attended any school. What sorts of demographic behaviors do we expect from a highly educated woman in that context? And from a woman with little or no formal education? So in a paper that we published together in Demography last year, we answered these questions by studying the marital timing of women in different educational groups and different educational contexts. This graph shows the marital hazards of women with different levels of educational attainment across the range of educational contexts, which is the percent of women with any formal education. And so it shows that in contexts where educational access is more prevalent, the marital behaviors of the women with no formal education, or a black line, start to converge upon those of the highly educated women. And so, in other words, the availability of formal education appears to be shaping the behaviors of women who are not themselves attending any school. And so we call this a bandwagon effect. And we identified that this bandwagon effect of later marriage among those with no formal education was largely achieved through a reduction in the rates of very early marriage. And so this leads us to believe that this spillover effect may largely be a good thing and a positive externality of educational expansion. So this brings us to our current research question, in which we recognize that women's marital behaviors are not shaped only by the composition of their female peer group, and we consider how educational expansion is a gendered phenomenon. Educational expansion brings about changes in the marginal distribution of men's and women's schooling, which in turn influences the marital behaviors of both men and women. As you recall, education has expanded dramatically across Africa over time, but it has not always done so at equal rates for boys and girls. And so before showing you a figure about educational gender gap across educational expansion, we want to remind you that each of these panels represents a different region in Africa, and that we see vast differences in region. And remembering these broad regional trends will be useful to you a few slides from now when we begin to describe the regional variations in assortative mating patterns. And so we've got this handy regional key up here for you that reminds you that in the next few slides, blue is going to signify West Africa, the gold signifies East Africa, and the red signifies Central and Southern Africa. So here, our x-axis is our chosen measure of educational context. That is the percent of men and women who attended any school. And on the y-axis, we plot the difference in the percent ever educated between men and women. And as education expands across Africa, that expansion tends to coincide with a growing and then a shrinking of the educational gender gap. And so this means that early educational gains tend to benefit boys, and girls tend to catch up later when educational expansion has progressed further. In West African countries, the blue, where educational expansion is still for the most part low, we tend to see increasing gender gaps as schooling increases. And then the rest of the continent tends to be in the middle or the right side of the figure, where educational access is greater and where girls are beginning to catch up to boys in their level of educational enrollment. And then you'll see this anomalous country line plotted down here. That's Lesotho, which has an unusual pattern of labor migration for young boys leaving home to attend school.
Is the idea that these are boys and girls from the same cohort, or men and women from the same cohort?
Exactly.
Okay.
And with that in mind, so this figure is showing male and female age mates. It's like I planted you in the audience. And so people who were born in the same birth cohort. But our study is primarily focused on educational differences between married couples. And so here we've plotted the same figure, but comparing the educational levels of husbands and wives within each female cohort, rather than comparing women with their male age mates. And you can see that our reverse U shape gets squashed down quite a bit, and that more observations fall below the x-axis, suggesting some female advantage in schooling. This is largely because husbands tend to be older than their wives on average, and so the educational, the gender difference in educational opportunities is somewhat attenuated by the fact that women come from a younger cohort, and we've experienced this, or we've observed this positive overall trend in educational access over time. But if we use a smoothing function to look across all of the data points, we still see a distinct increase in gender gap, moving from the lowest levels of educational access to medium levels, and then a corresponding closure of the gender gap at higher levels of access.
I mean, this is what we'd expect, right? Like,
Yes.
It has to be a U-shape if gender inequality works how we think, in the sense that men get advantage first. In order to get to 100%, women have to go to school at some point.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Right.
So Maggie and I have done some work with these data where we measured like the potential for the gender gap is constrained by the population that has any education at all, and we looked at things like the size of the gender gap relative to the maximum possible gender gap that you could observe, and we found some trends like that women start catching up more quickly toward the end than at the beginning.
Got it.
We published this in a very brief data visualization article in Sociology, so it was pretty much just this graph with
A more beautiful version.
a more beautiful version of this graph with a brief description. Okay, so changes in contextual level educational conditions can influence assortative mating through two distinct processes. First, an increase in prevalence of a given educational credential for men, women, or both genders will exert direct effects on the marital sorting patterns through changes in the availability of that credential in the marriage market. And so we call this process compositional constraints. And second, changes in the educational composition of a population can indirectly influence assortative mating by altering the social conventions undergirding the marital sorting process. Conventions which designate some intramarital status differentials as respectable and others as improper. And so the role of sociocultural conventions can be assessed by measuring the deviation of a population's marital sorting patterns from the range of patterns that would likely occur if men and women married randomly with no regard to educational status. So starting with that first process, I'll show you how educational expansion might influence marital sorting through compositional constraints. Here we're using this diagram to help you imagine scenarios where men and women pair off randomly with no consideration of potential partners' education levels. So in the next 3 slides, we're also going to be defining 3 assortative mating outcomes: homogamy, hypergamy, and hypogamy. And if these terms are unfamiliar to you, you may want to jot them down because we will be referring to them throughout the remainder of the talk when Maggie takes over and presents our results and conclusions. So, in a low educational scenario, where lack of formal schooling is the predominant education level for men and women, we see a lot of educational homogamy, which are marriages in which husbands and wives have equal levels of educational attainment. And we see that in these low education contexts because you have uneducated women and men marrying each other. And then if educational access expands along a gendered pattern such that primary education becomes the modal credential for men while women remain largely uneducated, we're going to start seeing more hypergamy. Those are marriages in which women marry up in educational attainment. And then in high prevalence settings, it's possible that women's educational attainment can overtake that of men. We see that in a number of Central and Southern African countries today. And so in these settings, we might start to see higher levels of hypogamy. Those are marriages where a woman, where her educational attainment exceeds that of her husband. But sex-specific prevalence of individuals with various levels of educational attainment, it doesn't have absolute influence over marital outcomes because people aren't married randomly. Instead, when individuals are matched on the marriage market, they or their families make decisions that are guided in part by social conventions. These social conventions are enacted through the individual level preferences of brides and grooms, through familial interventions into the marriage search, and through broader societal gendered expectations and moral taboos. They're likely to be specific to a given educational status. And so, for example, the stigma of a woman being more educated than her husband will differ if she has 5 years of education and her husband has none, compared to if she has 15 years of schooling and her husband has 10. Additionally, these conventions are unlikely to remain stationary across time. Instead, when the educational composition changes in a population, these social norms are also likely to change as the social meaning of a given credential shifts and as gender roles and family forms are transformed through the expansion of formal schooling.
Can you just give a story on, just so we can imagine what that looks like, that change?
I think that's going to be the rest of
That's
the
going to be,
talk.
okay.
Yeah. Great.
So we may observe more homogamous pairings than we'd expect to see if everyone were paired randomly, if individuals in a society have a propensity for homogamy. And if individuals have an aversion to a certain type of pairing, like hypogamy, we might observe a below expected number of hypogamous marriages in which wives are better educated than their husbands. In our study, we're examining only the ever married individuals. So as we observe it, aversions toward certain pairings are perfectly balanced out by propensities toward other types of pairings, like homogamy or hypergamy. But in practice, aversions could also be exhibited in other ways, like by opting out or by being excluded from the marriage market altogether. So this brings us to 2 research questions that we address in this study. First, we ask, to what extent does cohort-level educational access influence the prevalence of assortative mating patterns? Looking across Africa and comparing cohorts with nearly ubiquitous access to school to those where schooling is rare, we examine how often women marry up, across, or down in educational attainment in each country cohort. And secondly, we investigate to what extent different educational contexts lead individuals to exhibit different propensities or aversions toward assortative mating outcomes. And so to answer this question, we subtract the compositional constraints that are imposed by gender-specific differences in educational compositions from the observed prevalence of assortative mating patterns in order to exclusively investigate social conventions. In most regions where educational assortative mating has been investigated, educational access had already reached moderate levels when data collection began. And so this means that many studies of assortative mating capture a period of time when women's educational attainment was rising relative to men's. When investigating assortative mating during a period of educational expansion like this, that means that researchers tend to identify the declining prevalence of hypergamy and the increasing prevalence of educational homogamy. But again, these studies have tended to study the later stages of educational expansion when female educational access has been rising relative to male. And so it remains unclear whether the opposite outcome An increase in the prevalence of educational hypergamy would occur during periods when male gains are outpacing female gains, as tends to occur in the early stages of expansion, and as we've been observing across many parts of West Africa today. And so the structural constraints of the marriage market suggest that a widening educational gap will bring about increasing prevalence of hypergamy, but this outcome could be tempered by transformations in social conventions concerning who should marry whom. Regarding propensities, around the world, scholars have documented a long-standing cultural preference for unions in which husbands are at least as educated as their wives, and a corresponding aversion for female status-dominant relationships. In sub-Saharan Africa, the cultural expectation that husbands be better educated than their wives is pervasive and well documented. But that said, we aren't aware of any studies that use African data to quantify marital propensities in any systematic way. When measuring changes in propensities over time, studies from different world regions have yielded different results, including increases, decreases, and no changes in the propensity for homogamy. These studies are often motivated by the idea that high propensity toward homogamy signals rigid, closed boundaries between members of different social groups, and that marriages between individuals of different educational levels, that those signify some sort of societal openness. As Maggie will discuss at the end of our presentation, we are not so sure that this is an appropriate interpretation of the meaning of homogamy in the African context. Yes?
So are you using these words for the total pattern of marriage or for the pattern of marriage after you control for composition?
Great. So propensity and aversion are the words that we're using for after we've controlled for composition. And so prevalence is a function of both composition and we hesitate to say preferences because so often it's not that you've really married who you prefer to marry, it's that you've married the best match that you can make given the circumstances. So it seems that the word that gets used instead is propensity rather than preference. So prevalence is both composition and propensities, and then propensities is just, or I should say prevalence is both composition and conventions, norms. Propensities is marrying above or below what would be expected in a random sorting. So we've taken composition out of the picture. Yeah.
Will you be looking at those who don't marry and the educational composition of men and women who don't marry and so on?
We don't, and so Maggie's going to describe how our approach is in the spirit of a log linear approach, and that type of approach just sorts, it like scrambles up husbands and wives. And so we're only observing the people who are married. There's a different approach that gets used within the field, but it has the problem of, it's called a force of attraction approach. It looks at everyone, but there are various issues for our study, like it's not cohort-based, and it relies on an ability to estimate all the eligible people in a population at a given time. And because Africa, it's distinctly difficult to tell who's eligible, especially with such high rates of polygyny. And so maybe in a different context, if a person is married, then you can say that person's not eligible. But in this context, it's very hard to say.
So we'll talk at the end about how we think that never married conventions could feed into what we're doing. It's important to keep in mind that what we're looking at today is only what social conventions appear through the married population. Okay, so hi everyone. So with that, we'll turn to our results, beginning with prevalence of assortative mating outcomes. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you a graph with 32 different panels, one for each country that we've studied. But first, I'm going to highlight what to look for in that graph, so I'm going to train you by drawing your attention to just a few countries. So to begin, these two countries represent assortative mating in Ethiopia and Malawi. throughout the rest of our presentation, the turquoise color, unfortunately they show up a little less different here, but it's okay. So the turquoise color in the middle represents hypergamy, and then the dark blue represents homogamy, and purple represents hypogamy. And we'll label them for that, so you don't need to memorize that. So like with the graphs showing the educational gender gap, the x-axis here is our chosen measure of educational context. It's the percent of a cohort that ever attended any school at all. Because virtually all African countries experience, all countries in our data, experience educational expansion over time, these graphs, because they're country specific, can roughly be read as moving left to right over time. And because Ethiopia and Malawi experienced dramatic educational expansion over time, we observe a long span along the x-axis for these two countries. As education expanded, Ethiopia experienced a dramatic increase in hypergamy prevalence. So we highlight this increased hypergamy prevalence with a red plot outline for Ethiopia. In Malawi, in converse, where prevalence of hypergamy declined as the proportion educated expanded, we've outlined the plot in black. So in contrast with the long lines that we observe for Ethiopia and Malawi, there are other countries in our data, like Angola and Madagascar, where we observe less educational expansion, which makes our squiggles relatively short. So sometimes this is driven by not having as much data. So in Angola, as Sarah mentioned, we only observed 26 birth years, and that's because there was only one survey available for Angola. During that 26-year period, education expanded relatively little. In other cases, our short span along the x-axis is driven by low levels of change and not by a short period of observation. So across the 42 birth cohorts that we observed in Madagascar, for example, there was little change in the percent who attended any school, which makes the length of the assortative mating lines in our graph quite short. So one more thing to call attention to you before I move on to the varsity version of this graph, is remember how I said that we're using red outlines to show increases in hypergamy and black to show decreases in hypergamy? So in countries where the differences in hypergamy between first and last observed cohorts are significant, we make the outline heavy, like you can see for Ethiopia, Malawi, and Angola. And in countries where it's not significant, we have a lighter outline, like we did for Madagascar. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the assortative mating trends as education has expanded across our 13 West African countries. So as the bold red boxes indicate, significant increases in hypergamy are the norm in West Africa. You'll notice that many West African countries fall toward the left side of the plots because of their low baseline levels of educational expansion. You might also recall that educational expansion from the lowest levels to the middle levels tends to come with a widening of the educational gender gap, both within peer groups and between married couples, and which gains in educational access benefit men more than women. So from an educational composition perspective, it is not surprising that these are countries that have undergone increases in hypergamy rates. There are simply more educated men than women as education has expanded. So although this trend seems relatively straightforward from a compositional perspective, it's important to note that it is yet to be discussed by other scholars. So demographers have been documenting an end of hypergamy around the world and even in Africa. So it's notable that we identify so many countries that exhibit significant trends in the opposite direction in recent decades. And we think that this emphasizes the importance of looking at country-specific trends and of taking a cohort perspective when investigating this question. So when we look at trends for East, Central, and Southern Africa, slightly different patterns emerge. Significant decreases in hypergamy are more common, as highlighted by these bold black boxes. And again, from a compositional perspective, the falling prevalence of hypergamy is unsurprising in some ways. Many of these countries are at more advanced stages of educational expansion, so they start further along on our x-axis. And where girls have begun to catch up or even surpass boys in their school enrollment. On the marriage market, then, there will be smaller marginal differences in the educational compositions of eligible men and women. So overall, looking across all of our 32 countries in our data, we find more evidence of increasing hypergamy than we do of decreasing hypergamy. So there are more red panels than black panels, and there are more heavy red panels than heavy black panels, showing significant changes. So taking all of the countries' trajectories together, here we're plotting the prevalence of hypergamy, homogamy, and hypogamy. So each squiggly line in our graph represents one country. And the heavy black lines are just smooth averages across the points in our data. So for hypergamy, oh, and the x-axis here, again, is the percent who attended any school at all. So here it's important to not interpret these as unfolding over time, because we're aggregating countries. And so each of these lines starts at approximately the same period, give or take a decade or so. So for hypergamy, we identify an inverted U-shaped relationship in which the prevalence of hypergamy rises and then falls as education expands. For homogamy, we observe roughly the opposite. Prevalence falls and then plateaus as education expands. And the prevalence of hypogamy, so marriages in which women marry down, is relatively low across educational contexts, with this outlier being Lesotho. But it does rise as education expands in a pretty consistent way. So in the following slides, I'm going to break down each of these trend lines by a wife's own level of educational attainment to show you how women of different educational statuses are contributing to these aggregate trends for each country.
Could I just have one?
Yeah.
So if this were purely compositional, I guess we'd expect the minimum of homogamy to be at 50%.
So in a few slides, I'm going to show you exactly the purely compositional thing
But
for
but the
this.
fact that it's over, could you just interpret that in words, that it's
That it's
farther?
over what?
Well, the minimum occurs at 60 or 70%, not at 50%
The minimum
of, say, homogamy.
of homogamy. You mean the minimum of our U?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. I don't have the compositional one memorized enough to interpret that. But in a few slides, I'm going to show it to you, and so maybe you can do it in your head. Sorry. All right. So here I've plotted the linear regression line for each country, breaking the data down by educational attainment categories. So no education is on the left, then primary, then secondary, and then higher education, post-secondary education. So because we define homogamy, hypergamy, and hypogamy using credential categories, we don't observe hypergamous pairings for women with higher education, because by definition they can't marry up, because they're already in our highest educational category. So the three plots in the bottom panel that we observe data for together help explain the inverted U-shaped hypergamy trend exhibited in the top. So country cohorts at low to middle levels of educational access are dominated by middle education women who exhibit very low prevalences of hypergamy in these contexts. As education expands, rising hypergamy prevalence among no educated women contributes to an increase in the aggregate hypergamy. Ultimately, at higher levels of educational access, the high prevalence of women with secondary and higher education pulls down our aggregate levels. In these contexts, educated women exhibit lower likelihoods of hypergamy or are unable to marry up because they've already achieved the highest level. So basically, this continuing increase has less of an effect on our aggregate line because the share of no education women decreases as we move across our x-axis, and the share of higher education women increases. So the steep declines in homogamy observed early in the process of educational expansion appear to be driven by declining homogamy prevalence among no educated women. However, because they constitute a smaller share of the overall population moving rightward, their continued declines have little influence on our aggregated homogamy trends at higher levels. And so here we can see that the increasing trend in hypogamy is primarily driven by the declining share of women with no formal education, who exhibit no educational hypogamy because they cannot marry down, being uneducated. The aggregated increases in hypogamy may also be driven by higher shares of highly educated women who have higher levels of hypogamy across the educational access spectrum. Among primary educated women, we see a decreasing trend in hypogamy as educational access increases, which is a stark contrast to our aggregated trend in the top panel. So together, these panels show the changing assortative meaning behavior of women of different educational levels across the full range of educational expansion. But they don't tell us the extent to which these patterns are driven by compositional constraints or by social conventions. So with that in mind, I'll now turn to our second research question, slightly different version of the PowerPoint, in which we isolate the contribution of social conventions on mating patterns. So if each wife were randomly assigned a husband, and if personal characteristics and social conventions had no impact in pairings, what would be the expected prevalence of assortative mating across these various educational contexts and educational levels? So we plot these expected values here in gray. So in spirit, our approach for calculating these expected levels is very similar to a log linear models approach. By cross-tabulating husbands and wives' characteristics and measuring the deviation from expected random pairings, log linear models shuffle husbands and wives just as we have done here. But log linear models don't always work well with sampling zeros, which we see a lot of in our data set, moving across the full range of educational expansion. We also feel personally that log linear models can be convoluted and confusing to non-experts. And so we've developed a simulation approach, which has the added benefit of being easy to visualize and relatively easy to interpret. So what have we done with this simulation-based approach? So it's pretty simple. For each country cohort, we generate a simulated population of 1,000 couples, and assign both wives and husbands to the exact same range of educational attainment that we observe in our data for that cohort. We constrain them to be size 1,000 because DHS sample sizes vary quite a bit for reasons unrelated to trends in education. So we wanted the same sample sizes so that the magnitude of the standard errors is not biased by having more observations for one country than another. So next, we generated 10,000 bootstrapped samples of 1,000 couples out of these simulated population vectors, and basically marry off men and women randomly for each of those 10,000 simulations. For each of these bootstrap samples, we then calculate the proportion of couples that are hypogamous, homogamous, and hypergamous using our educational attainment categories. And here we're just plotting the mean values for each of those 10,000 with a linear regression for each country. So this is the expected under compositional, if only composition were driving it, what we would expect to see. And so this is the same figure with observed values superimposed onto the graph. The extent to which observed values, or our colored lines, deviate from simulated values, our gray lines, represents the effect of social conventions. For example, among educated women, we see an evidence of an aversion towards hypergamy. In other words, despite the high prevalence of hypergamy that we observe among educated women in settings with widespread access to education, here, a random sorting situation would actually predict higher levels of hypergamy and lower levels of homogamy than what we observe in reality. As another example, among secondary educated wives in the third column, we observe an aversion towards hypogamy at low levels of educational prevalence, settings where these women, these secondary educated women, constitute a small educated elite. In these contexts, them marrying down in education, they marry down in education at much lower rates than they would under conditions of random sorting. So this graph with the superimposed values helps us to see how the observed patterns deviate from the mean values of our simulated random sorting scenarios. But of course, these scenarios are themselves subject to variation, right? We did 10,000 because we don't expect to see the mean value of the simulated proportions each time. And this graph doesn't show the variation in our random scenarios. It's also somewhat hard to read and asks you, our viewer, to do some additional work to figure out where the gray and colored lines deviate and whether this suggests an aversion to or propensity towards a given marital behavior. So to more clearly depict the degree to which observed results differ from our expected range of outcomes, we've plotted the deviations from simulated values in terms of their z-scores, using the standard errors of our simulated population vectors. In other words, using our 10,000 bootstrap samples, the y-axis simply shows the number of standard deviations that each observed value lies either above or below the simulated mean value. So a value of 10 here on our y-axis represents prevalence of hypergamy, homogamy, or hypogamy that is 10 standard errors higher than the prevalence that would be expected if spousal pairings were influenced only by composition or if couples randomly sorted. So values that fall above the x-axis represent a propensity towards a category of assortative mating, and values that fall below the x-axis represent an aversion towards that category. So just to make sure we're on the same page, here we can see the propensity towards homogamy among no-educated women in high education settings that I pointed out to you previously in that superimposed plot. And here is the aversion towards hypogamy at low levels of educational prevalence that I pointed out for secondary educated women. So this graph is kind of a lot to take in. So I'm going to break it down for you by marriage type, beginning with
So I can
homogamy.
understand the
Yeah.
units here. Does each cohort and
Oh, sorry,
country
I-
appear multiple times or one time, or this one?
Each
Does it appear-
cohort appears once, so the lines are countries. So each line is a linear regression across all country cohorts for each country.
And is the same country cohort appearing in each column?
Yes.
For one in different status?
But they're with different women, right? So different women for each country cohort contribute to only one of these 4 graphs. So in each country we have,
But the same country cohort does not appear in different colors?
yes, it does.
It also appears in different colors?
Yes, so the
Okay.
colors, yeah. So each country cohort has, so for each country cohort, we have calculated the proportion who are hypogamous, homogamous, and hypergamous for each educational value. So basically each of these, so this is a mirror image because there's no hypergamy at the lowest level,
Okay.
right? So, and this is a mirror image because there's no hypogamy, right? Or I said that opposite, but you understand what I mean. So, yeah, so basically every country cohort has each different color and each educational status. So there's 256 times 4 times 3 dots underlying these linear regressions. Yeah.
So this
Yeah.
is just a clarification. So you said above the line is propensity. So
Yeah.
what has to, but in each of those there are 2 things, one above and one below. So which one are we looking at? The dark one, the green one, which thing is
So the key
signals?
is down here, which might, so homogamy is this color, hypogamy is purple,
Okay, but that's what,
and hypergamy is green.
so what I'm trying to ask is, when I'm looking at the left
Yeah.
column,
Mhm.
there's something above and below.
Yeah. So this
So
is,
what you're, wait,
so, mhm.
I'm just, let me get the.
Okay, yeah.
So is what I'm looking at that there's a propensity and aversion?
Yep.
Okay, so
So
there's always
because,
both.
yeah, they always add up to 1.
Okay.
Yep.
That's
So a propensity towards marriage for no educated women, if there are more marriages within education group than expected, then conversely there's also going to be fewer marriages up than would be expected. So it's an aversion towards hypogamy, which leads to, or coexists with, a propensity towards homogamy.
And the difference is, the middle 2 columns, you actually have 3 categories.
Exactly.
So they're not mirror images.
That's exactly right, yeah. Otherwise, we could have only plotted one of them. But because there's 3, yeah, you need all 3 to see what's happening.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so as I said, a lot to take in. So we're gonna go through it marriage type by marriage type, and I'm going to sort of point out where we see propensities and aversions. So we're gonna start with the blue, which appears kind of greenish on this projector, which is homogamy, marriages within the same educational level. So homogamy propensities are positive across all countries, at all stages of educational expansion, and among women of all levels of educational attainment. This means that homogamy is more common than would be expected under conditions of random sorting. suggesting an enduring social convention supporting within education pairings at all educational levels. Homogamy propensities are particularly high among women who went further than secondary school, whose prevalence of homogamous marriage tends to be 10 to 20 standard deviations above what would be expected if pairings were random. And one more thing, we only plot these if we have at least 30 women in each educational group, which is why we don't have lines for this part of higher educated women. They really start to be a significant part of the population, about a quarter of the way across our axis. So perhaps our most notable finding with regards to homogamy emerges for women with no formal education. In nearly all countries, educational expansion increases the propensity towards marrying within educational groups for no educated women, representing a widening social boundary between women with no education and any educated men. So hypergamy propensity, marrying up for women, declines as education expands, regardless of wife's educational attainment, both within countries, as evidenced by the predominance of downward sloping country-specific lines, and across countries, as evidenced by the fact that the lines beginning on the left are higher than the lines that begin towards the right part of each axis. Sorry. Pause while I flip the page. Okay. So for women with no formal education, deviation from expected hypergamy prevalence is negative for all observations. But in low education contexts, we see a weak aversion towards marrying up for women with no schooling. Rates of hypergamy are slightly below what we would expect under conditions of random sorting. In contexts where more individuals have access to education, hypergamy prevalence deviates far below expected values for these women, representing a growing aversion to hypergamic pairings. Among primary and secondary educated women, these downward trends in hypergamy cross our x-axis, representing a declining propensity towards hypergamy and ultimately a growing aversion towards hypergamy as educational access increases. So primary and secondary educated women's changing conventions towards marrying up is due to a loss of status of these credential categories as education expands. So whatever elite societal position being primary or secondary educated has at this side of the x-axis is no longer held by women of that same credential category on the right side, when many of their female age mates have gone further in school. So these middle educated women also, importantly, demonstrate weakening aversions towards hypogamous pairings. So in other words, our negative trend is not sort of taken over by homogamy for these women. Instead, the mirror image is more hypogamy. So they go from marrying up, not to marrying across, but more to marrying down, which is important to note and supports our statement, my statement for the previous slide, that what we're seeing is a change in the status of these credentials. So basically, this trend, this positive trend, especially for primary educated women, but also for women with secondary educated women, provides additional evidence that middle education categories are experiencing a loss in status as education expands. Okay. So, across sub-Saharan Africa, educational homogamy, when we're talking about prevalence, is the modal outcome. In nearly all countries and birth cohorts, individuals are most commonly married to people with their same level of education. We also observe regional differences in prevalence and how these prevalences have changed over time. In West Africa, where educational access tends to be lower than in other African regions, we see significant increases in hypergamy. In other parts of Africa, we tend to observe the reverse. The dominance of educational homogamy is driven, at least in part, by the consistent propensity towards educational homogamy that exists in all countries, all time periods, all educational contexts, and among women in all educational groups. We also observe that primary and secondary educated women, as educational expansion increases, we see social conventions for these women move from propensity towards hypergamy towards a propensity towards marrying down, or hypogamy. And for highly educated women, we find evidence of persistent and strong hypogamy aversion, suggesting an enduring social boundary between university-educated women and men with less education. So stepping back, it's worth asking whether intramarital status differences, like educational hypergamy, should be interpreted as being good or bad for women or for society. Scholars have long interpreted homogamy as a proxy for rigid and closed class boundaries, which may be true in Africa as well. So the increasing propensity towards educational homogamy that we observe for individuals with no formal schooling could signal widening social difference between education groups as widening opportunities and worsening opportunities for upward mobility as education continues to expand across Africa. But for highly educated women, homogamy could also be a good thing, reflecting more egalitarian marriages or marriages in which partners met in school and have a lot in common. Sorry, the slides changed since I printed my script.
That's for the next slide.
Great. Along these same lines, we believe that other scholars' interpretation that heterogamy, or marriages across educational status, is good for society may be ill-founded in Africa. One could imagine a scenario in which heterogamy reflected true mixing of the population, or love-based pairings, as some people say. But in Africa, hypergamy dominates pairings in which men and women differ in educational status. So rather than representing relationships that are progressive and love-based, hypergamous pairings reflect patriarchal norms, which are cause and consequence of women's inferior status. So although hypergamy propensities have been falling across countries, hypergamy prevalence continues to rise for women with low levels of educational attainment, leading to net hypergamy increases over time in many countries. Increases that run counter to social conventions for these groups. And yet, if and when hypergamy does fall across Africa, as we see in so many other parts of the world, we hesitate to interpret that as a panacea for intramarital gender injustices, because we think that likely spousal power inequities would just take on new forms. And indeed, recent research by Julia Behrman has identified a backlash to a closure of the educational gender gap between married couples in the form of increasing prevalences of intimate partner violence in places where we see hypergamy decline. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much. Lots of questions.
I'll take notes.
Great. Okay, why don't we start with you?
So your unit is the cohort country,
Yeah.
but some substantial part of marriage is a local market,
Yes.
altered by migration patterns, and however, across the local market, there's substantial compositional differences in many of these countries. So sitting back here, I'm getting a take-home message that there's lots of compositional and perhaps very little propensity thinking that the compositional effects, when you carry them down to the local level, must be larger than the compositional effects that you're seeing at the national birth level. Is that a lesson I should take away, or should I?
So what you're saying is that if we measure conventions as a deviation from composition, that if we drill down to the local level, can you translate what you just said into math?
Yes. So at local level, there are going to be places with lots of schools and lots of education in the cities, and in the country, there are going to be places with smaller levels, and so the compositional availability will vary strongly across countries. And
That's
so
true.
one thinks composition could drive more of it than what you see by combining it.
Yeah, we've talked about this a bit, that it's possible that what we're identifying as a propensity or an aversion could be like a growing urban-rural divide, for example. And so when we're scrambling the husbands and wives at the national level, but if really you live in a small village where you and your potential spouses all had very little access to education, we're going to possibly identify this as a homogamy propensity when really it's operating within one's localized constraints. And it's something that by working with this country level data, we're not able to isolate those region level effects.
Yeah, we did try to break it down by region, but when we break it down by educational status of each country of cohort, we just don't have enough women to break it down further. Yeah.
Yeah, so super interesting talk. When you're doing the simulations and you're kind of looking across a different percentage of people with education, are you accounting for that kind of trend you showed in like the very first slide where at like kind of the middle levels, there's a very big gender gap, and at the higher level, there's not a very big gender gap?
Yeah, great question. So in the paper version of this talk, we do a series of fixed effects models in which we control for various country level variables, including the educational gender gap. And we find that the same sort of broad patterns hold up. We tried to incorporate educational gender gap as one of our axes in which we visualize these changes, but it doesn't really work because of the curvilinear effect that we see over educational access. So if we put educational gender gap on our x-axis, then we would be bringing together contexts at the very beginning and the very end, which have low educational gender gaps. And what the dominant social change is this educational expansion. And so even though there are places with educational gender gaps that are low, we find that like the Malis and the South Africas don't look very similar in their marital patterns. So we kind of moved away from those graphs. Yeah.
But like the simulations, if it's like 50% of people have access to education, then both men and women in the simulation have 50%?
No, so we take the
okay.
educational attainment of the men and the women.
The husbands and wives.
The husbands and wives, yeah, right. So we take the husbands and wives of those cohorts and we scramble their own educational attainment categories. So they have exactly the educational attainment of what we see in the data. Yeah, Danny.
Thanks. I think you're going to have a great answer to my question because you just hinted at it with Joe, but it's hard to identify contextual effect. There's lots of things that are different about these countries, and like the neighborhood effects, people thought really hard about how to identify contextual effects. So, I don't want to be causality. This is basically a causality question, so I'm sorry. But so how do we identify that? I mean, lots of things are changing, right? There's economic development, there's more contact with maybe with Western cultures. I don't know if that's true. So maybe a fixed effects framework helps, or time varying covariance help? How do you deal with that?
So our main purpose here is actually more descriptive than causal. So what we really want to figure out is across this vast spectrum of educational statuses, what kinds of pattern variation do we see, rather than isolating educational context as the main driver. So like for instance, like West Africa and Central Africa, they differ in other ways too, right? We see that, West Africa, they have more French colonial presence than Central and Southern Africa. And there's all these other differences that could be driving it.
To the extent you're going to get conventions, that's a thing, right? You're sort of trying to give some meaning to this. Norms, conventions, that's a...
Right, and so we're interpreting, what we mean by conventions is literally the deviation from random sorting, which is, a loose...
Okay.
So it's a loose definition of conventions, but I think it is observably a behavioral pattern that deviates from what we would expect in only population sorting matter.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be because of educational composition. It could be other things that are associated with it.
Right, so as I said, in our fixed effects framework, we do see that the same patterns controlling for country level variables and also for period and cohort fixed, or country and cohort fixed effects. So I do think that educational access is an important driver of these differences, but I'm not prepared to say that because the expansion of schooling is, as you say, correlated with other developmental processes, and so it is possible that some other, like urbanization, for instance, could be driving some of these changes. But what we're really setting out to do in this broad swath of projects is to look at what happens when we look across this x-axis, rather than isolating the effects of schools completely independently of other processes. Yeah. Ron?
First, I wanted to mention an article you may know. It's an ancient article by Louis Young Lee on cross-cousin marriages and why they're more common for cousins through father and from mother or the reverse or something, and shows that it's all explained by demographic composition and different stage of marriage. This was a comment on anthropological theorizing about what might be going on. Anyway, but what I wanted to say was, I think it's terrific what you presented. I'm not sure that sort of presentation of your results in the Z-score framework is the most conducive to insight, because, I mean, it tells you something about whether they're statistically different or not, but it doesn't help you know whether they're big or small, or when you compare across panels, you don't know whether the standard deviations are the same.
So this is the absolute difference, and it's pretty similar to what we see in the Z-score difference. Originally, we had the absolute difference. So this is observed minus expected, so basically just taking those gray lines and subtracting that out.
Percentage points?
Proportion, so it's the proportion.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing I was
minus.
thinking.
Yeah.
And then you could indicate somehow whether those are significantly different or whether they're not.
Yeah, because the graphs look so similar, we didn't put a ton of thinking into which y-axis makes more sense, because we see the same patterns. But I take your point that z-scores might not be so intuitive. Yeah, to us, what I like about it is that because there are differences across the different cohorts, just in terms of the variation that we see within the vectors, in terms of the variance, and this doesn't give us a sense of that. It takes the mean value of the simulated vector as like the expected, whereas really what we should be thinking is that there's a range of expected values. And so to me, like as somebody who teaches intro statistics, I like the z-scores because it allows for that range of expected values to shrink and narrow. But I take your point that like it doesn't tell you intuitively the magnitude, which you might want to know more. Yeah, Carl.
The SDs in the Z-space, they come from the simulations, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So if you just increase the size of your simulations, would you get smaller SDs?
So the simulations all have the exact same size.
Right, but if you decided you wanted smaller SDs, just make all the simulations larger, right?
But it would just lower. It would just change the numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you're presenting them as Z-scores, then it matters as absolute value. Absolute differences, it doesn't.
Right, I mean, so I guess I'm thinking of z-scores less as like, this is statistically significant, and more as how much does it deviate from expected. And so, because I think you're right, like we're making the simulations, and if we made a simulated vector of 100, we would see fewer that are above that z-score of 2 than we do in ours, which is a simulated vector of 1,000. 1,000 is smaller than any sample size that we have, so it's not like we made it big to make it significant. Most of the sample sizes are like 10,000. But I take your point. But so for me and for Sarah, I think we went to z-scores just because it does sort of allow you to see how much more different it is than what would be expected. But it's an interpretation in the realm of the full range of z-scores, not of the number. Like, so we're not looking for like ones that are statistically significant. The simulation allows us to make everything significant if we want. Yeah. Yeah. Josh.
So I just one technical question. You're presenting things with 4 educational categories here, but your definition of homogamy and hypergamy are whether you've had any schooling or not?
No. So it's within these 4 categories. So if you're primary educated and your husband is primary educated, then you're homogamous. If you're primary educated and your husband is secondary educated, then you're hypergamous. Okay.
So I mean, the class of models. The kind of no model here, you've done kind of the dependence model, but another no model that you might want to consider is that there's, say, constant homogamy across all groups. Or there's other no models that you might want to consider as the residual being what you're interested in.
Yeah, so one of I think this is what, I'm not exactly sure I understand what you're saying, but I'll say this and then you can tell me if it is. One of the other things that we did is we looked at absolute difference in years of schooling between husbands and wives, so ignoring credential categories and treating like a 3-year difference in years of schooling. So basically the gap between the husband's years of schooling and the wife's. And we did a linear regression for that and basically defined hypergamy and hypogamy using that. and got a similar thing. We think that this is better because social credential categories are really socially important in Africa. So you see steep drop-offs. In fact, this is our next project, is looking at actually, I think we have a slide for it. Looking at variation in credentialing regimes across Africa as being a major determinant of schooling dropout. So basically, people stay in school until they finish primary, whether primary is 6 years, 7 years, or 8 years. And so credentials are like, whether you have 8 years doesn't necessarily matter, but whether you have a primary diploma or some primary is much more socially important. Similarly with junior secondary and senior secondary and higher. So that's why we chose the credential category definition. But I take your point that marrying across, you could think of it more.
Well, so this is kind of a little bit in the spirit of what Ken was saying. There are compositional, kind of purely demographic models that go beyond the independence model that you wouldn't need more data for. So kind of these are the kind of uniform association or the constant diagonals or whatever. There's a whole set of these things that, and I think you can make a case for why you want to define what you're interested in as the residual beyond that. But there's more than one choice. Can I ask a second theoretical question? You've taken the perspective of the woman. Is the story the same if we take the perspective of the man? I guess when I think of women's education, I think of kind of power and autonomy of women. When I think of men's education, I think about the changing economic meaning of education.
Right.
So maybe that's just my bias in this, but is there...
So in terms of the actual graph, I mean, because basically if we took the men's perspective, then I'm just trying to think about what would happen. We would have no marrying. It would change the lines, but the data would be the same, right? Because like a data point here that's hypergamous for women is going to be hypogamous for men. And similarly, a data point that's homogamous for women is going to be homogamous for men. So I think that it wouldn't change our data at all because we're constraining it to married couples and looking and comparing. Is that right, Sarah? Am I thinking correctly?
I think so.
But, yeah.
So my question maybe is related to this. I'd be curious in settings where there's a lot of polygamy, if that would mean the men's perspective might be different.
Yeah, so methodology, because I guess because we have polygamous households in here and we're just treating each one is sort of a separate example of differences. So we do have fewer husbands than we have wives. So that might change it a little bit. Yeah.
So you talked about concern about the people in the no formal education category, but over time that category would be shrinking too. So are you like incorporating that into your welfare analysis in some way?
The adverse selection kind of.
Oh no, just that there's much fewer women in the no formal education category as you move across the axis.
Although there are, like in maybe, is it Niger today, still half of women our age, like in their late 20s, early 30s, I think, not in my early 30s anymore, half of like young-ish women in our data set in West Africa still didn't attend any school.
Right, and I think that, so a short way of saying that is that this is not time. And so like the end of each of these lines is the most recent cohort. And so there are still lots of women who are living on this side of the x-axis. Yeah. So it's true that hopefully education will continue to increase in West Africa, and so we may move everybody towards here, but that's not, I think it's easy to interpret this as a time trend, but it's not. Yeah. Here's a hand in the back.
Thank you for this. So I'm curious, you guys mentioned, let's hope those strange because lots of male labor migrants, probably South Africa, I imagine, but.
Yeah, we don't have South Africa, but yeah.
But Lesotho, so I'm curious about the role of migration, right? So in a lot of these countries, there's like significant and gendered migration internationally within the region or out of the region.
Yeah.
Curious about what the role of that. And then I didn't remember you guys, you said you would talk about those who didn't get married.
Yeah.
And I didn't remember you guys talking.
I switched scripts, and it was in my script and not Sarah's. So what I think never married would be doing here would be if we see, so basically if we see, say here, a strong aversion towards hypogamy for these women, my guess is that we also would see, in these places where we see this strong aversion, we would also see lower rates of marriage for uneducated men and highly educated women, because some of this aversion is also going to play out in lower, and then being basically excluded from the marriage market. So there's only a certain extent to which we can have these propensities move away from composition before there's no men left for them to marry, right? And so what I think we would see if we also looked at never marriage is a similar story for these strong aversions and propensities. So never married, I think, can contribute to the same social processes, but we couldn't figure out how to put it into the same analysis. So we have some graphs looking at never married across educational groups and across this axis. But this paper already feels like it has enough, so we didn't put it in. But
The next one.
the next one, maybe. But I think that it's important to consider that this is only looking at people who have found partners, and that we do see variation, pattern variation in never married rates across these exact same panels. So for both men and women, never married rates are not static across education levels and across educational contexts. Yeah. So.
Because in recent cohorts, because cross-sectional data, late marriage just gets you knocked out of the data. So many of these people may marry, but
So we're-
we think
yeah.
education associated with marrying later.
So what we
especially
did,
for women.
we
They're not-
identified the earliest age by looking at basically the elbows and never married.
Okay.
And so we start here with women who are 25, which in
Yeah.
Africa is a relatively late age to
Okay.
marry. So even among highly educated women, with the exception of Namibia, which has a very late age of marriage, almost everybody in the cohort
Who's good
is
married?
already, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let's stop here. Thank you so much.